Imagine waking up in the dead of winter, your breath visible in the icy air, surrounded by the walls made of mud and dung. This wasn't just discomfort, it was a nightly battle for survival. Medieval peasants faced temperatures so brutal that frostbite and hypothermia were constant threats. So how did they endure? Their ingenious, often grim strategies, from fire, banking, embers to sleeping in human lasagna formations, reveal a resilience we can barely fathom today. Let's step into their frozen world and uncover the desperate measures that kept them alive. Your breath comes out in white puffs as you stand inside the dim interior. The walls around you aren't wood or stone, they're a lattice of sticks smeared with mud, straw, and worse. That sour tang in the air? That's the dung mixed into the wattle and daub holding this place together. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of proper timber or bricks. Their homes were built from whatever could be scavenged from the land, and it showed. Look up at the roof. Those uneven thatch bundles need replacing again. You can see daylight through at least 3 spots where the reeds have rotted or blown away since autumn. The floor beneath your feet isn't even, just packed earth that turns to muck when rain drips through the ceiling. People called these cottages impermanent in tax records. Most barely lasted a generation before needing complete rebuilding. But in winter, rebuild wasn't an option. You had to make this drafty shelter work. Now imagine the wind picking up outside. That nice, thick wall you're leaning against. It's full of hairline cracks where the daub has shrunk as it dried. Every gap becomes a frozen knife's edge slicing through your clothes when the temperature drops. Families spent weeks each fall stuffing moss into cracks, stuffing rags in window openings, laying fresh straw over dirt floors for insulation. A peasant's winter was a constant battle against the creeping cold. Patch one hole today, 2 more appear tomorrow by dawn. The smells would hit you hardest after dark. Smoke from the cooking fire with no chimney to escape. The sharp stink of a milk cow penned in the far corner for warmth. Damp wool that never fully dries. Rotting vegetables stored in the rafters. Old sweat and unwashed bodies pressed together for heat. Medieval homes didn't smell like pine and fresh bread, they smelled like survival, like desperation with every inhale. Here's something modern insulation hides from us, just how fragile the barrier between indoors and outdoors really was. One missing shingle, one unpatched crack, and your hut's interior temperature matched whatever hellscape was happening outside. Records from 14th century England describe peasants finding their beer frozen in the morning, icicles forming on the inside of their doors. You didn't get sick from being cold back then, you got sick because your lungs were assaulted by freezing air all night, every night. Tiny flaws became life-threatening flaws fast. A fist-sized hole near the roof meant a steady drip of melting snow onto your sleeping area. Windows covered with oiled parchment instead of glass couldn't stop frost from creeping across the surface. The room temperature of a medieval cottage in January. Probably never above 45 degrees even with a fire going. Your breath fogged all day indoors. Yet somehow, these flimsy structures worked well enough to keep generations alive. That fire crackling in the corner wasn't just for cooking dinner, it was the only thing standing between your family and freezing to death before dawn. Medieval peasants didn't have thermostats or space heaters. Their hearth was their lifeline, pumping out smoke as much as warmth through the brutal winter months. You'd think a fire would make the room cozy, but forget everything you know about modern fireplaces. Most peasant homes didn't have chimneys. The smoke from that precious fire had nowhere to go except up into your rafters, then back down into your lungs. Your eyes would water constantly. Your clothes reeked of wood smoke year-round. That hacking cough everyone had by February. That was the price of not dying from hypothermia instead. Keeping the fire going wasn't optional. Let it die overnight, and you'd wake up to a home colder than the outdoors, your leftover stew frozen solid in its pot, your fingers turning white at the tips. So peasants developed a nighttime ritual called firebanking. Before bed, someone would carefully rake the embers together, bury them in a thick layer of ash, creating a sort of insulated cocoon for the remaining heat. Done right, those coals would stay hot enough to restart the fire in the morning. Done wrong, and you'd spend the pre-dawn hours shivering while trying to spark new flames with flint and steel. The hearth wasn't just a heat source, it was the center of household life. This is where you cooked every meal, crouching over pots balanced on stones in the fire. Where you gathered after dark since it provided the only light besides the moon. Where children did chores like shelling peas because it was the only spot warm enough to bare your fingers. Where grandparents told tales to pass the endless winter nights. That flickering light and unreliable warmth became the heartbeat of the home. But that heartbeat came with constant risks. That pile of dried rushes by the wall. Night watches happened in the worst cold snaps. Someone, usually the adult lightest sleeper, would take shift staying awake to feed the fire. Not just tossing on a log and going back to bed, but carefully nursing the flames, adjusting the fire bank, making sure no sudden draft stole your heat source. The watcher might recite prayers or sing softly to stay awake through those long, dangerous hours before dawn. Even the ash had uses. After sifting out the coals, peasants saved the fine powder to make lye for soap. They spread it on icy paths outside. Mixed with water, it became a crude mortar for patching walls. Nothing from the hearth went to waste, because waste could mean death when winter lasted 6 months. That thin line of smoke rising from your roof meant more than comfort, it signaled to neighbors that your family still lived. During the worst blizzards, folks would peek through cracks to check if nearby cottages still had smoke. No smoke might mean no survivors inside. The social order of the village depended on that shared understanding: we all keep our fires burning, or none of us make it to spring. The hearth's glow revealed other truths too. In its light, parents counted heads before sleep, making sure no child had wandered into the cold. Elders told stories that preserved family. History when most couldn't read. Couples shared whispers they'd never say in daylight. The fire witnessed births, illnesses, all the raw moments of life that happened because its inconsistent warmth somehow kept death at bay another day. We think of fireplaces as decorative today. For medieval peasants, that smoldering pile of embers represented the fragile border between survival and catastrophe. Every morning it still burned was a small victory against winter's tightening grip. And when you finally crawled out of the sleeping pile toward its welcome heat once more, you understood, this wasn't just fire. This was your family's stubborn refusal to disappear into the dark. Imagine spending a December night packed shoulder to shoulder with 14 other people, plus a cow. That wasn't medieval overcrowding. That was winter strategy. When temperatures dropped below freezing, peasants engineered what historians diplomatically call communal sleeping arrangements. You'd call it a desperate, snoring human lasagna where every layer counted. The sleeping pile followed strict rules. Babies and toddlers got buried in the center where body heat pooled. Grandparents, if they were lucky, might score spots near the fire. Healthy adults formed the outer layers, taking the brunt of the cold like human insulation. Your spot in the mash depended on your usefulness to the family. Farmers with strong backs got more insulation than aging relatives. Their beds would give modern sleep experts nightmares. Most consisted of straw sacks laid directly on dirt floors. The luckier families had wooden bed frames stuffed with whatever fibrous plants grew nearby: straw, dried ferns, occasionally wool scraps too worn for clothing. These makeshift mattresses compressed into lumpy pancakes within weeks. By February, you weren't so much sleeping on straw as in it. The fibers flattened into a scratchy nest crawling with fleas. Speaking of fleas, peasant families made peace with vermin. A flea-free bed meant you'd skimped on insulation. Those itchy pests nestled in straw provided microscopic air pockets that trapped heat. Pulling apart your mattress to clean it in winter was unthinkable. Better to scratch all night than lose that crucial warmth barrier between your body and the frozen ground. The smell hit visitors hardest. Between unwashed bodies, mildewing straw, and the ever-present cow 3 feet away, the bedroom air stayed thick. Chamber pots sat in corners because no one dared venture outside at night. Wet coughs echoed in the dark as respiratory infections spread through the damp warmth shared so generously among sleepers. Even sleep positions had strategy. Facing inward doubled skin contact points. Spooning wasn't intimate, it was thermal efficiency. Back-to-back arrangements helped adults conserve warmth while keeping watchful positions near children. The elderly often slept sitting up against walls to ease arthritic joints and minimize pressure sores from thin bedding. Winter reshaped household architecture. Smart families built sleeping platforms near the hearth's residual heat. Others dug shallow pits so sleeping areas sat below cold air currents. Some crammed entire extended families into a single subterranean, earth cellar where geothermal warmth supplemented body heat. These weren't bedrooms, they were survival pods. Death lurked in poor stacking choices. Records show occasional suffocations when too many people piled atop a sick elder whose protests went unheard. Infants sometimes smothered beneath well-meaning siblings trying to share warmth. A collapsed roof beam could wipe out an entire sleeping clan in one snowy night. Still, they kept piling together, because the alternative was freezing alone. Morning brought its own miseries. Untangling stiff limbs from the heap took minutes. Frostbite checks happened daily, toes and fingers got counted like livestock. The first person up faced the cruelest chore, leaving the human oven to restart the hearth fire before residual warmth bled from the house. Many peasants described winter mornings as physical pain radiating from every joint. Yet this torture yielded unexpected intimacy. Shared breaths fogged the same air night after night. Children learned family histories through whispered stories in the dark. Couples bonded over wordless moments rubbing warmth into each other's hands. Survival forced a closeness modern families rarely achieve in houses full of separate rooms and glowing screens. These sleeping piles worked too well sometimes. Peeling off those shared sleeping blankets meant facing another survival tactic: the medieval peasants' layered armor of dirt and wool. Their winter wardrobe wasn't about fashion. It was a biological defense system where every stain served a purpose. That crust forming on your tunic, that wasn't laziness. That was your first line of defense against frostbite. Your morning routine started with the same linen undertunic you'd worn for weeks. Itchy didn't begin to describe it. The fabric had stiffened into a scratchy shell from months of sweat and skin oils. No one changed base layers in winter. Removing them meant exposing bare skin to freezing air. You'd pile on wool tunics next, their coarse fibers trapping what little body heat they could. Every garment stayed on until spring unless it literally fell apart. Washing clothes was a summer luxury. Try dunking your only shirt in an ice-covered stream and you'd either break through the surface and freeze, or wait days for the sodden fabric to dry indoors. Both options meant risking death by exposure. So clothes stayed on bodies, accumulating layers of grime that modern noses can't fathom. The stench of unwashed wool, old sweat, and wood smoke created a personal atmosphere that followed you everywhere. Those stains weren't just dirt, they were insulation. Grime filled the tiny gaps between fabric fibers, creating windproof barriers. Mud caked on hems added weight but also trapped warmth close to the skin. Grease from cooking built up around necklines, stiffening collars into crude scarves. Peasants essentially wore their environment as a second skin, transforming everyday filth into a survival tool. Foot protection was a nightmare. Only the wealthy had proper leather boots. Most peasants wrapped their feet in rags before cramming them into wooden clogs. The lucky ones might stuff the toe space with dried moss or hay for insulation. Frostbite wasn't a possibility, it was a daily risk. The clothing paradox struck hard in winter. Wool kept you warm but absorbed moisture like a sponge. Moving outside meant your cloak collected snow, staying indoors left it damp from hot humidity. Either way, you spent months in perpetually damp fabric that chafed skin raw. Lice loved these conditions, their constant biting kept you aware of every thread touching your body. Headwear wasn't optional. A simple wool cap could mean the difference between frozen ears and making it to spring. Hoods stayed up at all times, their edges stiff with grease from hair and smoke. Scarves were precious heirlooms passed down when they became too threadbare for other uses. Losing your hat wasn't just embarrassing, in deep winter, it might be a death sentence. Children became bundled oddities. Parents swaddled them in every available scrap of fabric until they resembled lumpy sacks with faces. Too young to generate much body heat, kids relied entirely on these outsized layers. Toddlers barely moved under the weight of patched-together coats and oversized mittens tied securely at the wrists. The hands suffered terribly. Gloves were rare treasures usually reserved for the wealthy. Peasants made do with fingerless mitts or strips of leather tied around palms. Working outside meant regularly stopping to blow on stiff fingers, watching your breath curl around knuckles already turning white. Many winter chores became group efforts just to share what little hand warmth existed. Women's clothing posed special challenges. Layered skirts collected snow at the hems, their weight increasing with every step through slush. Aprons served dual purposes: protection from stains during cooking, extra insulation when wrapped around the torso at night. Nursing mothers had it worst, exposing skin to freezing air during feedings no matter how many shawls they piled on. Under all this, bodies became their own enemies. Skin rubbed raw at friction points, inner thighs, underarms, waists where belts cinched damp fabric tight. Open sores led to infections when bacteria flourished in the warm, filthy layers. Scratching lice bites created wounds that wouldn't heal in the constant damp. Yet peasants accepted these torments because the alternative, removing layers, meant certain frostbite. The wealthy didn't fare much better. Fancier clothes used finer wools and linens, but the same principles applied. Even nobles rarely washed winter garments, relying on perfumes to mask the reek of months-old body odor. Fur linings helped, but required constant maintenance to prevent moth damage during storage. Servants in castles suffered most, expected to work in drafty stone halls while wearing relatively lightweight livery. Color choices reflected practicality. Dark browns and grays dominated peasant wardrobes not by choice but necessity. These hues best hid the stains of daily survival. Bright dyes faded quickly under layers of grime and smoke. Only at weddings or festivals would you see clear colors emerge from storage chests, briefly transforming villagers before returning to muted reality. The psychology of perpetual filth wore people down. Months without bathing bred a particular kind of resignation documented in medieval writings. Love poetry avoids mentioning body odors for good reason. Courtship happened through layers of wool with noses accustomed to personal stenches. The concept of freshness simply didn't exist between November and April. Yet this system worked. Archaeologists examining medieval graves find fewer cold-related injuries among adults than we'd expect. Their grotesque laundry habits saved lives. By modern standards they stank beyond comprehension, but surviving chronicles suggest people simply stopped noticing by midwinter. When everyone smells like a damp sheep, noses adjust. Starvation loomed over every decision. A failed harvest meant emptying grain stores by midwinter. Families reduced meals to thin gruel, chewing on leather or bark to trick their stomachs. Archaeological finds show some peasants resorted to eating rodents when desperation peaked. The elderly sometimes volunteered to eat less, knowing sickness would take them first when rations dwindled. Dreams turned bizarre on full stomachs. Modern studies confirm heavy meals before bed increase vivid dreaming, something peasants noticed without understanding why. Legend spoke of winter spirits visiting sleepers, likely hallucinations from overtaxed digestion. Dreams of feasts taunted those on starvation's edge, their bodies craving what pantries couldn't provide. Indigestion was the trade-off for warmth. Lying on your left side after meals supposedly helped, folk wisdom backed by modern medicine. But in the press of bodies, you took whatever sleeping position you could get. Heartburn joined lice and damp as routine discomforts, better mild pain than hypothermia's deadly embrace. Food storage was its own battle. Root cellars froze solid without proper insulation. Grain stores attracted rats whose droppings might ruin precious supplies. Smoked meats hung from rafters, collecting hut smoke as extra preservative. Every spoiled bite wasted could mean an hour shivering come February when reserves ran low. Spring couldn't come soon enough. First greens like nettles and dandelions ended the monotony of preserved foods. Fresh milk returned as cows calved. But winter's lessons lingered. Next autumn's harvest would be stored with this year's hunger fresh in memory. Every meal was preparation for the next battle against cold. People adapted in disturbing ways. Some developed permanent aversions to foods eaten during famines. Others hoarded scraps long after winter ended, unable to shake survival habits. The line between thrift and pathology blurred when starvation haunted living memory. Modern P. The fire's dying embers couldn't heat the whole home, but a well-placed stone could save your toes from frostbite. Peasants mastered this simple physics: roast a rock in the hearth long enough, and it would radiate warmth for hours after the fire burned low. The trick was finding the right stone. Too thick, and it took forever to heat. Too thin, and it cooled too fast. Flat river rocks worked best, their smooth surfaces less likely to shatter in the flames. Once glowing hot from hours in the coals, someone would fish them out with an iron hook or green wooden tongs. Anything metal would burn unprotected hands through conduction. Wrapping required precision. A bare stone could scorch straw mattresses or igniting wool blankets. Old rags worked as insulation, but layers mattered. Too thin, and the heat escaped too fast; too thick, and you missed the warming effect entirely. Some families used hollowed-out logs or clay pots as containers, creating primitive bed warmers. The stone went inside, the lid went on, and suddenly you had a 12-hour heat source in your bedding. Not that it stayed put. People shuffled warm stones between family members all night like radioactive hot potatoes. The risks were real. Children burned fingers grabbing poorly wrapped stones still hot from the hearth. Grandparents' thin skin suffered blisters through inadequate cloth barriers. A forgotten stone buried too deep in straw could smolder unnoticed until flames erupted. Every winter brought stories of homes lost when someone miscalculated. Yet the alternative, no supplemental heat, was worse. People took the burns, knowing frostbite took toes more often than fires took homes. Then there was the strategic placement. Slide a stone under the straw where you'd lie. Risky, shifting in sleep could expose bare skin to burns. Rest it at the foot of the bed. Timing mattered. Leave food too long, and it cooled past safe eating temperatures, inviting spoilage. Retrieve it too early, and you wasted potential heat retention. Women developed rules of thumb. If the outside straw stays warm to the touch, the food's still safe. Children learned to judge readiness by the faintness of escaping steam when cracking the lid. Inefficient by modern standards, these devices stretched scant fuel supplies through brutal winters when foraging for firewood meant risking frostbite. The hay box had hidden bonuses. Slow heat meant tougher cuts of meat softened over hours without supervision. Grains continued absorbing liquid off the fire, stretching small portions further. Unlike reheating on the hearth, there was no risk of burning leftovers to inedible crusts, just gradual, gentle warming that preserved every calorie. When blizzards trapped families indoors for days, the hay box became a lifeline, allowing meal spacing without constant fire maintenance. Dangers lurked in complacency. Rotting straw attracted mites that infiltrated food. A poorly cleaned pot could sour an entire batch, wasting precious rations. Children tempted by hunger sometimes sneaked portions early, disrupting heat cycles. And like the heated stones, fire was a constant threat. One spark from a carelessly buried ember in the straw could doom a household. Yet generations used them anyway, because surviving winter meant balancing risks against certain suffering. Passing down these technologies was an oral tradition. Mothers showed daughters which rocks heated fastest in their particular hearth. Fathers taught sons how to pack hay around pots for maximum effect. Subtle improvements accumulated. This family uses sheep's wool in their box. That one preheats stones with the morning fire instead of waiting until bedtime. Knowledge wasn't written down, it lived in calloused hands that remembered exactly how thick the wrapping rags needed to be. Archaeology confirms their ubiquity. Psychology played a role too. That warm stone at your feet wasn't just heat, it was comfort, reassurance that maybe you'd make it to dawn. The hay box's faint warmth promised another meal would come despite the howling winds outside. Small comforts mattered when misery was constant. People endured because clever tricks made endurance fractionally easier. Faith often intertwined with these practices. Stones got blessed before heating on solstice nights. Crosses were chalked onto hay box lids to protect contents from spoiling curses. Ritual reinforced technique, blending practicality with spirituality in ways that blurred the lines between prayer and physics. After all, when survival balanced on a knife's edge, you didn't leave anything to chance, not even divine intervention. Which explains why saints' names were invoked while wrapping stones, and why farmers sprinkled holy water around hay boxes during Epiphany. Desperation breeds syncretism, the merging of ancient wisdom with newfound beliefs. Because when the wind howled through cracks and the fire burned low, even the most practical peasant might whisper a prayer over their primitive heater. Winter's cruelty made pragmatists of everyone, but desperation kept the faithful clutching at any available comfort, physical or spiritual. Because ultimately, survival wasn't just about tools. It was about believing spring would come again despite all evidence to the contrary. Stones cooled eventually. Hay boxes emptied. But hope, however strained, persisted in the rituals tying practical warmth to forces beyond human control. Now tell us, could you trust your toes to a smoldering rock wrapped in rags? Would you risk fire for fleeting warmth? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more glimpses into history's hardest winters. Turns out medieval peasants didn't just endure cold, they engineered around it with stones and straw long before modern insulation existed. When evening pressed in and the cold crept through the walls, prayer became as vital as firewood. This wasn't about salvation in the afterlife, it was about surviving tonight. Families huddled together reciting the same pleas their grandparents had whispered: keep the hearth burning, the roof intact, fingers and toes still attached by morning. Winter turned faith into something raw and immediate. Gods and saints weren't abstract concepts, they were allies enlisted in the daily war against freezing to death before dawn. Certain saints specialized in cold weather protection. Saint Same got called upon when throat infections spread through damp huts. People rubbed his metal against swollen necks while chanting verses, hoping to ward off the pneumonia that killed as surely as starving. Saint Nicholas, now associated with gifts, was originally begged to preserve households through lean winters. Farmers buried tiny iron crosses at field boundaries in autumn, asking his protection against early frosts ruining next year's crops. Every prayer had a practical target, every ritual a survival function. Physical preparations blended with spiritual ones seamlessly. Sprinkling holy water around the hearth wasn't just symbolic, it marked the fire's perimeter like a magical firewall against drafts. Some families stirred a drop into stew pots, trusting it might stretch meager rations further. Chalk blessed at Candlemas got scraped across doorframes in X-shaped patterns, creating visible barriers where warmth shouldn't escape and cold shouldn't enter. Even suspicious priests tolerated these practices because everyone understood, when temperatures plunged, you used every tool available. Communal prayers served as both comfort and early warning system. Nightly rosaries in village churches let people check who'd made it through another day. Missing faces meant either illness or worse, frozen corpses discovered when neighbors broke down doors after too much chimney smoke absence. Certain prayers directly addressed physical sensations. Blessed Mother, ease the ache in my joints, wasn't metaphor, it was arthritis from perpetual dampness. Saint Anthony, find what's lost, often referred to feeling in frostbitten toes. Petitions for daily bread specified coarse rye loaves that lasted longer than wheat. Nothing was abstract when survival hung in the balance. Holy water took on medicinal properties. Rubbing it on chilblains won't help medically, but the placebo effect eased some suffering. Splashing it across coughing toddlers couldn't cure whooping cough, but it made helpless parents feel slightly less powerless. When the line between life and death narrowed to a thread, even symbolic actions provided psychological relief. The dying received special rites tailored to winter's threats. Last rites for frostbite victims included prayers for the soul, and curses against the cold that took them. Graves dug through frozen ground required saints' interventions to soften the earth. Funeral processions became grim winter athletics, pallbearers shuffling carefully across ice while reciting psalms about deliverance. Even mortality adapted to the season. Children learned survival theology early. Bedtime stories featured saints outwitting winter demons. Lullabies doubled as memory aids for fire-tending schedules. Kids collecting kindling would chant little rhymes about perseverance, conditioning them to associate faith with practical action. Religion wasn't separate from daily life, it was the rhythm of survival set to prayer. Ironically, winter deepened faith through hardship. Spring's return seemed miraculous after months of suffering, reinforcing belief in divine mercy. Those who survived developed gratitude bordering on mysticism. Sunlight felt like literal grace warming frozen skin. Briefly, theology reclaimed its transcendence from pragmatism, until next autumn's first frost sent everyone scrambling for blessed candles again. Now tell us, would desperate cold make you pray differently? Which winter saint would you call on first? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more glimpses into how humanity survives when pushed to the edge. Turns out faith wasn't just spiritual, it was another form of insulation against the dark. The winter of 1315 didn't just bring cold, it brought the collapse of an entire way of life. What started as relentless summer rains ruined harvests across Europe, leaving grain stores soaking and fields too muddy to plant. By November, people knew they were in trouble. Then winter arrived like a hammer, freezing the ruined crops into icy mush while peasants watched their food reserves dwindle to nothing. This became known as the Great Famine, and it revealed how terrifyingly fragile medieval survival really was. You'd ration carefully at first, maybe having portions in December, telling yourself the worst wouldn't come. Then neighbors started showing up hollow-eyed, begging for handfuls of oats. By January, even the rats disappeared from granaries, picked clean. Families ate seed grain meant for spring planting, sacrificing next year's harvest for a few more days of life. Then came the bark bread, flour mixed with ground tree cambium that tore your gut to ribbons but quieted the cramps briefly. Dogs vanished from villages first, then cats. Chronicles describe emaciated mothers chewing leather belts to soften them enough to swallow. Fathers tore thatch from their own roofs to feed livestock that had become walking skeletons. The weak died first, children, then the elderly, their bodies sometimes too light to need proper burial in the frozen ground. Survivors developed a hollow-cheeked stare contemporaries called the famine look, where the eyes seemed too large for faces shrunken by hunger. Houses became death traps. Snow piled heavier than poorly maintained roofs could bear, and when one collapsed, disease moved in where hunger left openings. Pneumonia tore through communities already weakened by starvation. The coughing never stopped, hacking, wet sounds from every hovel as lungs fought freezing dampness without proper nutrition. Without fats to protect nerves, hands and feet developed agonizing chilblains, skin splitting open to expose raw flesh that wouldn't heal. Some villagers lost fingers simply trying to gather more firewood. Frostbite offered grim choices. Blackening toes meant deciding whether to amputate with whatever tools were clean enough, usually a wood axe and boiling water if you could spare it. Some chose to let gangrene run its course rather than risk shock or infection from primitive surgery. Those who survived amputations faced new dangers, stumps that refused to heal properly, leaving weeping wounds vulnerable to further frost damage. Communities fractured under the strain. Some villages banded together, pooling what little food remained to keep children alive. Others turned inward, with families guarding moldy grain stores like dragons over treasures. A few desperate souls took to the roads, becoming famine pilgrims, who staggered between settlements begging scraps until they collapsed in snowdrifts. Churchyards filled with mass graves where priests stopped bothering to name the dead. The truly desperate turned to taboos. Contemporary accounts whisper of cannibalism in the worst-hit regions, though these claims may have been exaggeration. More verifiable are records of peasants roasting and eating animal hides, parchment from books, even the dung of livestock seeking undigested grains. One chronicler describes a man executed for grinding human bones into mock flour. Whether factual or propaganda, the story reveals the depths of famine psychology. Children suffered most visibly. Their smaller bodies depleted reserves faster, their growth permanently stunted by malnutrition. The psychological toll reshaped survivors. Some developed lifelong aversions to foods eaten during desperation. A person who subsisted on acorn mush might never touch nuts again. Others hoarded compulsively, storing years of excess grain they couldn't bring themselves to consume normally. A few became famine prophets, traveling between villages promising upcoming catastrophes based on signs only they could read. Trade collapsed in regions worst hit. Without surplus grain to sell, peasants had nothing to exchange for salt, tools, or cloth. Markets shrank as merchants avoided areas where customers couldn't pay. Local economies shifted to pure barter. A wool blanket might trade for 3 days' worth of gruel. Fraud spiked with sellers mixing sawdust into flour or watering down milk until it was barely white. Architecture changed in the aftermath. Survivors rebuilt homes with steeper roofs to shed snow faster. Some villages relocated entirely to be nearer reliable water sources. Storage cellars got deeper and better insulated against temperature swings. These modifications weren't about comfort, they were about not dying the next time winter came early. Records suggest mortality rates between 10 to 25% in hard-hit areas. Some villages disappeared entirely, their fields reverting to forest as few returned after fleeing. The survivors carried invisible scars, missing fingers, stunted growth, chronic coughs from damaged lungs. Women suffered particular burdens, often outliving male relatives but facing new dangers as unprotected widows in unstable times. Yet adaptation continued. New crops like rye gained popularity for their hardiness. Improved grain storage techniques spread between villages. Some regions diversified livestock to hedge against single-species collapses. The desperate innovations of famine winters became the standard practices of following generations. Modern calculations suggest temperatures during the Great Famine winters averaged only slightly colder than normal. What made it catastrophic was the convergence of soaked harvests, exhausted reserves, and no safety net. Medieval peasants understood something we often forget: civilization is only ever 3 missed meals away from collapse. Their suffering demonstrates both the fragility of human systems and the stubborn ingenuity that keeps rebuilding them. So next time you complain about a cold snap, remember, your ancestors endured winters that reshaped history. The bones under your local churchyard may include frostbite survivors, famine orphans, people who ate leather to see spring. Their suffering earned the relative comfort you enjoy today. Let me know in the comments, would you have dared to eat bark bread knowing what it would do to you? How far would desperation drive you? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more hard looks at history's toughest survivors. Because understanding these stories isn't just about the past, it's about recognizing what humans can endure when winter comes for us all. Medieval peasants didn't just survive winter, they hacked it. Every smoky hearth, every flea-filled sleeping pile, every unwashed layer of clothing was a calculated move against the cold. They turned mud into insulation, body heat into a utility, and hunger into motivation. Next time your heater kicks on automatically, remember, your ancestors survived nights that would send you running for the thermostat within minutes. Their ingenuity built the foundation for the comforts we take for granted. If you found their struggles fascinating, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Winter always comes, but now you know how they beat it.